And we are watching Usman Toure live with us in the studio today, ladies and gentlemen. This incredible speech is what I've never remembered any African president or any leader of Africa made such a speech. Not even the leaders of today have made a speech that has inculcated all the facets from history to colonization, to investment, to culture, to education, to the standard of living, to the future. Everything that Africa needs at this moment is embodied in the speech of Usman Toure. Usman, how did you come to this? From the video, you didn't even prepare this interview. They just met you in a restaurant and you just came out and you spoke like this. Where is this coming from?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. As I said, I met this wonderful lady. She's doing a very, very good job in the Gambia because I am a subscriber to her YouTube channel. So while at home, sometimes I will go on YouTube looking at the videos that she has been uploading about the beautiful nature of the Gambia. So what happened is I was in one of the hotels around Senegambia, and I saw her, and then I said to my friend that I recognize this lady because she's doing a great job and portraying a very good picture about Africa and about the Gambia. So that is how I went to her, and then I said, "Hi, I recognize you." And she said, "Wow." And I said to her that I'm a subscriber to your YouTube channel and you're doing a good job. So she said to me that you cannot go without having an interview with me. So then I said, why not? Then let us give it a shot. So that is how this interview come about. And she is Juliet, and her YouTube channel is Black Seed. So she normally upload beautiful things about the Gambia, encouraging people in the diaspora, our brothers and sisters, to come back to Africa, work with Africans, and then try to invest in Africa because that is the future. So,
Osman, who are you? Just tell us
well,
about you a little bit because this is, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, Usman is a young Gambian, and I came from provincial Gambia. That's where I attended my primary and junior school, and then moved to the Combos that is in West Coast, where I did my senior school and finished high school in 2016. Then proceed to the University of the Gambia in the same year and graduated in December 2019. So while at the university, I was reading development studies, and development is a whole diverse course where you look into a lot of issues like political, social, and economic. Because the question that we normally have is that how do we make sure that we have that economic growth at the same time with a good human development, whereby we channel our economic growth into things that will make betterment for our society, and then how do we make sure that we promote that social cohesion and tolerance in the society at large. So that is it. And then for the spirit of pan-africanism and believing that one can do it in Africa, that you don't have to, not it doesn't mean that we are an island as Africa, but it just means that if you focus and then you give it all you can also make it out here in Africa. So Pan-Africanism is something that I have been reading a lot. I read materials from Garvey, from the pioneers, people like John Henrik Clark, and others, like reading a lot of issues and reading a lot of arguments about the betterment of Africa and how our colonizers have been using education as a tool to continue to dominate us. So looking at this complexity in the education system, one will come to realize that in order for us to decolonize Africa, we must do away with the old curriculum, which was designed purposely for domination by the colonial masters.
Correct, correct. And like you are saying, we also know, you talked about it. You said this is the time for academics and young scholars to rewrite the history. And so you're talking particularly about this curriculum. How do you think that could function?
Yes, saying that we need to rewrite the history, these are just not, things that I champion. This has always been at the center of Pan-Africanism and Pan-African debate. Ever since we knew, and this was the very reason why people like Gavi, people like Dubois, and Kwame Nkrumah and others all stood for their people, because they know that in one way or the other, our history have been, toxicated by individuals who hijack the reality of our civilization and then introduce a system that was never in our interest. So basically, you come to realize that they introduce an education system for us with a form of a history that we read, and this we do it at a very young age, telling us that the culture that we have, the history that we have, is not in line with modern civilization. So we needed to embrace a new civilization, a new history, as if the black man has no history. So that is why I challenge all young scholars in Africa and in the diaspora, as long as they have Africa in them, that we need to put hands on decks to make sure that we rewrite the history of Africa. And we can do that by depending on the great scholars who have been advocating for Pan-Africanism and the literatures that they left behind, and to expand on those bases, making sure that we have those books in our schooling system, and children have the opportunity to read and understand the real history of the African continent, and not just to rely on books written by foreigners whose main objective is to make sure that we forget that particular history that we have, that particular civilization that we have, and that particular culture that we have. And that was exactly one of the reasons why I mentioned that quote by Lord Macaulay, because in his address to the British Parliament, he made it categorically clear that Africa is a rich continent, that Africa has a history, it has a culture, and there are good people that that in order for the Western world to dominate this society, they need to overthrow our very backbone, and that is our education system. And that is 1835. You come to realize that from 1835, they had this in the British Parliament as an agenda to overthrow our very backbone, which is the culture of the African, the history of the African, the education system that an African child was given at the time. And if all these issues have been erased from the African continent, then the white will have the opportunity to dominate Africa forever. And that is how they introduce their education system to us. Now that you travel across Africa, you come to realize that people at my age can have the same opportunity to go to school, spend 12 years in school, and yet will not have a single skill. They cannot create job, and they will not be able to earn job. All what we can do is to wait for a government to do something on our own or for us. It doesn't work like that. The education system should be programmed in a way that it makes people job creators and not job seekers. That is exactly what I'm trying to say. That we need to understand the history of the continent, we need to understand the history of the African, and we need to revisit our education system to make it fit for purpose. And that is an education system that will be able to answer fundamental questions on societal problems and coming out with solutions to some of those issues.
When you look at the young people today, I mean, we're talking about on the continent, and and you see the outgoing, like they flee the continent, and most of them dying in the Mediterranean, like you see. What do you see? It's not just even the impact, like you said, the symptoms of this educational system that has made us to depend on jobs, and so they have to look. They have to go out of the continent in seeking for greener pastures. What is that for the continent? That's a loss.
Yes, and we need to understand that Africa is very rich, and this is exactly what Nkrumah said in 1963 at Addis Ababa, that Africa as a continent is rich, but its people are poor. And why is that? Because there is a system that is programmed to exploit these resources at the expense of the very people who live within this continent. Now, looking at the African youth moving to the West through the Mediterranean Sea, others using many other forms, you come to realize that that is happening because the education system, one that we have in place, and the mainstream media, the way in which the West is portrayed in Africa. Because that is why I said us as youths have a responsibility. And in order for us to know about Africa, we must not learn Africa from the mainstream media.
Correct.
The way they portray the images in Africa is biased. And the way they portray the images in the West is not true. They will never show you the millions of people that are homeless in the West. They don't have interest in that. But how will they make sure that they bring in people, giving them pictures of issues that are not even in reality, and then tapping them to the outside world? Now, these resources that Africa should have depend, and that is the youth, of course, because the most instrumental means or the most important resource of any country is the people, and particularly the youth. So
Correct.
if the African continent can well equip its youths to capacitize them, to make sure that they can have paid jobs within the continent, to make sure that they can have a decent environment, they don't need to travel outside. And if that is so, you come to realize that the youth or this active population will be able to protect the young, that is the children of Africa, and as well as the old.
Correct.
But if this is not put in place, you come to realize that our very opportunity that we have, and that is the youthful population in Africa, now we are losing them in the Mediterranean Sea. It is not just to see an African or to see Africans dying in the Mediterranean Sea. And also, the world need to look into this. Why is it that people have to die at the Mediterranean Sea? That is a big question for all of us to answer. The whole world have been watching this happening for so many years. And what is the solution to that problem? So African has responsibilities, but as well as the Western world, they also have a responsibility. Let us be realistic in our approaches. People are not dying just because boats are capsizing, but there are so many issues that are associated with it. So the first thing that we need to do as African is building the connection that we want. This continent have to understand that we have to stay focused, we have to stay connected, work together as Africans, and to understand that the development of this continent lies in the hands of the Africans and not in the hands of foreigners.
Wow. You talked about investing in Africa. The money has to stay on the continent, and we see that money can either be in form of resources, it can also be in form of the brain drain, that the young people relocating from the continent is already a GPD, is already a source of income for the continent, and then talk less of the death in the Mediterranean Ocean. And yes, do you think that how do I want to put it? Do you think that it is because of the ignorance? Because I realized that you were even given a scholarship to study out of Africa, and you said no, you wanted to study or to study the Rwanda model. What does the Rwanda model signify to you?
Yeah. Now looking at this, I had option, that is to choose to study in the United States, Canada, or in London. So I toned it down because what I saw and what I really want is not in those countries. What I want is in Rwanda. And that is a transformation that is going on. What Africa needs now is a transformation. My degree will not benefit me if I did it in Canada. No. What I want to see, because academics is not just in the classroom, academics is about the society as well in which you evolve from, because that is what intellectuality entails. You must be able to critically understand the society in which you are, your environment, and how to critically understand the solution to those societal problems. Looking at what is going on in Rwanda, they had a genocide. They recovered from the genocide. I mean, like they were able to establish justice commission. They were able to establish the rule of law. They were able to establish a good administration and then design a model of development. That is a miracle because the Western world never predicted such. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we look into places like Rwanda, we understand a transformation that is ongoing. And that transformation is what I need in the Gambia. The same transformation is what people need in Senegal. The same transformation is what people need in Sierra Leone. The same transformation is what people need in Liberia. So that is exactly what we're trying to say, that Africa need an African model. And for us to have an African model, we must not just be borrowing from Eurocentric models or American models. No, we have to look into what is working on in African countries because the realities are similar. If you go to Rwanda today, you see the same people as if you walk into the Gambia. So that is exactly what I'm trying to say, that we need to understand the continent. We need to travel across the continent. Our education system has to be in line to make sure that we have that quality education, that free flow of ideas from one country to another within the African continent to make sure that we can have that that African agenda, and then we push it to 2063 as they have it in the documents. But if we are not trying to do this, if we are not trying to see what works in different African countries and then to transform it in other parts of Africa, we will meet in 2063 again and explain to our own young generation why Agenda 2063 could not be achieved. Yeah.
Correct. You talked about the negative images of Africa in the West, and exactly that's what we're experiencing. Like it was designed that the educational system and the curriculum taught Africans only to graduate and go back to the systems that brought the education. For instance, I remember most of us, we've never done African history on the curriculum, like you're saying. If we did slavery, colonization, and talked about all these leaders in historical facts and even the empires that Africa had built, that would have helped a lot. But we spent time studying European history, fishing in Norway, all these kind of things that are not found on the continent. Now, today, do you have share this impression that even an African child that studies in Africa is ignorant about the continent? We're talking even about the resources.
Exactly. This is exactly what is going on. That you see somebody that will be studying in Africa and still be ignorant about the African society. And that is what we need to, overthrow. We cannot continue to live like that. And those are some of the reasons why you see them, or why you see individuals leaving the continent to the outside world, because that is what they taught them. You're not teaching them to understand their societies. They're not teaching Africans to understand the real African problem and how to think about solution to those problems. But then, how do you, if somebody is learning about the Western culture, learning about, in fact, there's a whole of an argument about whether this culture even exists. So, but then you come to realize that that is the brain drain. They're doing it at a very, very young age, whereby people don't even have the opportunity to know about themselves. And this is exactly what John Henry Clark said, that if you want to control a people, you must control what they think about themselves, how they regard their culture and history. If your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and history, he needs no prison walls or chains to hold you. because you already program in a system where you don't even understand your own society. So that is what we need to defeat. That is what we need to do as young scholars, making sure that this curriculum that we have is tailored in a way that it is going to benefit the African continent. It is going to benefit the African child. And this, I mean, both the ones in Africa and those in the diaspora, because this affects us all. In the Western world, the same thing. An individual being an African descent and yet don't know about the African history because that history is hijacked. So we have a chance as young Africans today. We got the information, it is out there. We know the way in which they've been portraying the Western world, and the reality of this is not true. So therefore, we need to embrace what we own and then design and set a pattern for our own development as Africans, and therefore we move the African agenda ahead.
Correct, particularly on this subject of images and education. It is so how do I say, malicious, because this political system has been, this Eurocentric system has made it in such a way that they give Africa the Western image as the paradise on earth. And then they give the Europeans the African image as the poorest and beggar continent of the world. These are two images. The same ignorance that we Africans on the continent are having about our own continent, its resources, is the same issues that the Europeans, the normal European citizens, are having also about Africa. Now, let me tell you what happened in the diaspora, particularly those of us that are involved in developmental politics or developmental education regarding Africa, or whose hearts are beating for Africa. You begin to realize that even the West are so ignorant about their own community, but they know so much about Africa in a negative way, but their own European countries, they have no idea. You ask German children or German kids or youth, who is even their president or their national anthem or their flags? A lot of them don't have an idea. But if you show them African pictures, negative pictures, poor people, begging, suffering people, they understand everything. So it is a malicious system that was really made, not even only to rip our history from us, our dignity from us, who we are, but also on the contrary, selling the opposite of who we are to their own people. It is so crazy why we see Europeans come to Africa to develop Africa. Why is the question that you see all these foreign development agencies coming always to build schools or hospitals or churches or to help? You see NGOs flooding the whole continent in the name of help, because the picture that they have about Africa is a helping continent, it's a helpless continent, it's a beggar continent. So the investors don't see it as a potential for a market to invest their capital and their money. What investors see is to invest in these poor sectors. That's why they do vaccines and bring to us. They do all sort of medications, because one of the agendas is the diseases on the continent. It's a continent of hunger. That's the first thing why they destroy our agriculture and our food, and they produce these GMOs and this genetically modified food to us, because the first characteristics of Africa out here is hunger. The second characteristics is war and conflicts. It's a continent filled with war. Even though we have 55 countries and we have just 19 conflicts on the continent, in Europe, they know Africa is always at war. That's why its citizens are running away. Number three, Africa is a continent that is filled with poverty, abject poverty. And so all these ones are opportunities that they are selling for their own people to invest in these sectors in Africa. That's why we see, if it comes to diseases, it comes to everything, it's Africa. Vaccines, testing of everything is Africa. Because the first number one characteristics that the West know about Africa is diseases. Secondly, even education, like you're saying, why are they coming and building schools? or they make pictures of children that cannot go to school, and they begin to tell you about the potential of education. And you see, in Germany, you go to any political discourse or any conference, they're always going to tell you, no, the problem of Africa is Africa needs education. But when you ask them, what kind of education does Africa need? Has it got to do with schools? What is the kind of education? They cannot answer to you. So you see the kind of malicious system that the world has put Africa into. Make us dormant, make us rip our history from us, and then this same history, they sell it to their own people in a negative form, and we keep seeing these agendas coming. Over to you.
Exactly. So that is it. Like, you understand that the images they're portraying is one of the main reasons that is making investors to stay away from the continent. And that is why I call on Africans and African descent to invest in Africa. We cannot have individuals coming here and doing investment for us. They will never do that in the interest of the continent. Investment can only be done in the interest of the continent if it is done by Africans and by African descent. You know why? Because of the capital flight. And there are two things that we need to look into. Capital flight from our own authorities and capital flight through the private businesses. Sometimes the loans that we take, we don't need them. They trap us with interests that we will continue to pay on ending loan. You look at the private businesses. When they invest in Africa, you come to realize that at the end, they will take all the resources because they exploit us. They exploit those working under them. And at the same time, the money will not stay in the continent. And if the money doesn't stay in Africa, you know what happens? It makes it difficult for capital accommodation. People cannot have money in their hands, and at the same time, they cannot make saving. But Africans across the world need to understand that this continent can only be built by us. Before they invest in foreign lands, you die and the system takes everything from you. Why not invest it in Africa? Because these images are just created by individuals through the mainstream media. People have to travel in Africa to see the realities. People have to travel and see what is actually happening. But you cannot just sit at one place and want to learn about Africa through the mainstream media. It doesn't work like that. When we travel, we will understand and we will see the potential of investing in Africa and investing in the African youth. And then you also come to realize that we have a big role to play in a sense that when we look into the whole system within the African continent, you will come to realize that we need to invest in skills and also in decent and paid jobs, whereby African youths no longer have to be hungry of going to the Western world, because some of them are still trapped in camps. And that was not the reason why they left the continent. So those are the issues that we need to look into to make sure that we equip the African youth with the quality of education, to free them from the brain drain, and then to make sure that they have a decent and skillful works where they can earn their living within the African continent. And we can do this. We just need to work together and to bridge the disconnection that is going on in Africa. After this video of mine went viral, I received calls from all over Africa. And then sometimes when people speak native languages in Africa, I even ask them, what language is this? Are you saying that I don't understand the language, but I don't even know the name of the language itself? And that is happening due to the disconnection. That if I live in the Gambia, I have nothing to do with somebody living in Kenya. I have nothing to do with somebody living in Somalia. I have nothing to do with somebody living in Liberia. That is the disconnection that we need to fight as African youth. Creating networks where we can easily meet, having platforms where we can easily interact to make sure that our ideas within this continent is well understood by people living in the continent. And that is, we need to look into globalization in general. Before, we were talking about fighting colonialism. At some point, African leaders met in Addis Ababa and talked about neo-colonialism, imperialism. But do we understand what globalization today is doing to the African continent? So you come to realize that sometimes we just embrace ideologies where we have no clue about.
Correct.
Let us look into it. Today, they brought to us in the central debate at everywhere in the world, at the United Nations, EU, everywhere, they're talking about globalization, globalization. But what are we globalizing? Should our brothers and sisters die in the Mediterranean Sea if globalization is a reality? If we have international laws protecting migrants all over the world, do we need to have our brothers and sisters in refugee camps? That is not true. So they need to explain to us, what are we globalizing? I understand it in different phases. That is in ideas, in the market structure, and in the cultural side. If we want to globalize ideas, we want to have a global market where goods and services can be, trade. We want to have globalization that is in culture and etc. This is not true, and it is not in the interest of the African continent. And I am ready to stand anywhere and defend this argument that Africa is not benefiting from the globalization of ideas. What are we taking from the West, and how does that match with our realities as a continent? Let us look into the policies that we have been embracing since the end of the Second World War. After the formation of the Bretton Woods institutions, with all the promises that they told us, with all the policies that we have been embracing, starting with the structural adjustment plan, what does African countries benefit from this? With all the loans that they have been giving us as a continent, apart from trapping us under abject poverty, and we have nothing to do about it. Let us look into the market that they're telling us. Are we globalizing a market system? Is it easy for Africans to trade within the African continent? Is it easy for Africans to trade among themselves? It is even cheaper for us to trade with the Western world than trading among ourselves as a continent. Now we have free trade agreement within the African continent, and yet we have a problem of implementation. We have a problem of understanding each other's realities and a good regional integration that will enable us to have that economic development that we desire and channeling it to the interest of the general public. We are not seeing this. Let us look into the African culture. For far too long, our culture has been penetrated. It has been hijacked. They don't want to embrace it. They don't want us to know about it. Instead, we're just getting the Western culture, taking it every day, valuing it more than the African culture itself. I don't need to go to school to learn about righteousness. I don't need to be in school to learn about honesty. I don't need to be in school to learn about generosity and kind. Those are fundamental values rooted in the African culture, that it is just a matter of growing. But today we are not seeing this. Why? Because we have embraced things that are not in the interest of the African continent, that the Africans don't know. And that is exactly what the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism have been fighting for. And I always say this, if we want to fight for the African continent, if we believe in Pan-Africanism, we must have the same spirit as they did. Gavi had a spirit, and he believed in it, and he fought for it, and he died for that. The same way Nkrumah and others. So that is exactly what we need to understand and fight for this continent in the interest of the African society.
This is all of us are Africa, and your ancestors are proud of you. And the voice that we've been looking for change and the young continent is gradually speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, I already had said it on the Pan-African Daily TV that it is not even the leadership that we're talking about today on the continent of Africa, because our ancestors and our philosophy would just rise up these leaders from nowhere, So most of the people we keep looking and saying these are leaders, they are not yet born. I want to open up the lines in the next couple of minutes when I give you, or when we take some other questions from you or listen to you on this topic. Now, when you look at the leadership of Africa and you see even the Agenda 2063, we have been advocating and saying that's a colonial agenda. Like you say, a lot of these regulations abroad or these constitutions and these agendas have never been implemented. So we want to understand and come out with another alternative agenda for Africa, which is exactly what you're saying, the declaration of our forefathers and the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism. Because the issue is we keep even criticizing these other agendas. We have no alternative for the African child, for the African youth to orientate it. Even the system of education, we need an alternative system. What is your take on that, Usman? Because after our discussion, I said, the issue is not the mainstream media like we are operating. Just come here, you lecture to us, you mentor to us. But the issue is to get a permanent organization of all these leaderships that are talking for us to revisit this declaration and this alternative. In terms of even spirituality, we need an alternative if we have to call it Bible, but it has to be an African own. African education, African everything needs its own history, like you're saying. Do you see that like an alternative?
Yes. We need to understand that as a continent and as a people, there are so many things that are happening and we need to rethink about them. Of course, we need to have a paradigm or a system or a rule that entails the African values and the African way of life. If it is a book, we should go for it. Why not revisit the Pan-African agenda? I mean, in its reality, going to look into the issues that have been advocated for by those Africans. Put everything in document and put it in papers and make sure that we transform this in all generations.
Correct.
We teach the child the values and the principle of Kroma. We teach the child the value and the principle of Gavi. We teach the child the value and the principle of orders and orders. So that is what we need to do. But today, we don't even know them. Ask me about Nkrumah. What the only thing I can tell you, yes, Ghanaian president. He took Ghana to independence. After all, why? What? And he have been fighting for the African continent. You come to countries like the Gambia, we have our own individual who stood for this country, fought for the country, at the same time fought for the African continent. But today we don't know them. We don't even have them in our curriculum. We don't learn about them in school. So that is exactly what we need to change. In order for us to have a breed of new leadership, we must revisit the history of the continent by the pioneers and those that struggle for our liberation. Their ideas, their principles, we need to learn them. We need to understand them. But if we don't do that, we'll continue to have those comparators where you have a group of elites sponsored by outsiders, trained by outsiders, and then imposed on us by outsiders, and we will not have anything to do by it. That is why I said, if we all think that leadership is the problem of Africa, because that is what you hear every day. You speak with somebody, they will tell you, our problem in Africa is not all this, it is just the leadership style. Yes, I agree. Leadership is the problem today. But how do we change it? Do we change the leadership problem by traveling to the West and stay there? No, we don't. What we really need to do is understand that as a problem and then work on the solutions. And the solution to that is equipping the youths of this generation, making sure that they understand the real value of the African continent, making sure that they understand what the continent really needs to solve its own problem. And therefore, we can do a lot of things together. But without understanding this, we cannot. And we don't solve that leadership problem by staying in the West and insulting them every day. No, they will continue to live here. They will die, their sons and daughters will take over.
Correct.
So in order for us to change it, the mindset has to change. We need to understand the African continent, and we need to work as one another to make sure that we implement the African agenda in reality.
Correct. I'll be opening the lines, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions and your impression. This is the greatest conversation amongst others that we are having here, solutions by Africans for Africans and by Africans. And as you can see, it's just the beginning. I told you, and I said it, and it's so amazing how we are right now at 2,000 live viewers, and it's going to climb up to a massive number before tonight. Why am I particular about this issue, Osman? We already had this discussion, you and I, in the background, and saying that yes, we need these practical solutions, and the first thing that we are talking about is this education. And one thing that I want to congratulate you that you've been saying is that even us, the adults, don't even know the education to be able to teach. So it means we need to really go back to form this kind of academic structures and scholars that are only focused on the Pan-African philosophy, or the philosophy of Ubuntu, exactly like you said. We don't need to go to school to just learn kindness. We don't need to go in churches and synagogues for someone to tell us to be nice to ourselves or to love one another. We already have them deeply rooted in us. And now we're seeing that all these institutions are the institutions that are also sponsored by the Eurocentric ideas and philosophies on the continent, and that are draining our women and our children and locking them up into these societies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And thank you to our callers. This is just amazing. And I am so glad that, we are connecting. And that is what we need as a continent, making sure that both the individuals living in the diaspora and those living in Africa are connected in different platforms where we can exchange our ideas in this manner. So a lot of things are going to change, and many individuals will automatically get motivated by some of these comments and some of their contributions, of course, and we can set a pattern together as African youth.
Correct.
So one of the individuals says, how do we organize ourselves to realize our dreams, or to realize the African dream? I think the first way in organizing ourselves is making sure that we get rid of the disconnection, that the issues happening in Kenya, I will feel the same thing, as an individual living in the Gambia. Once we can exchange to one another, when we can meet each other, and then we can communicate to one another, and then we can tailor our development agendas in a way that every country's interest is going to reflect in it within the African continent, then therefore we can realize the dream that we all desire. And that includes the youths coming together as well, because they are the actual.
Wait, I'll pick your call later. Okay, Fatu?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, just hold on.
Because the youths are the individuals that really matters in this situation. So another individual as my inspiration for a united Africa. So I have a belief that Africa will unite. I am optimistic that this generation is ready for it, and
Correct.
we just need to push. The ideas are out there. People are ready. Individuals are willing. African youths have traveled around the world, and they understand the realities of every corner of the world. So it is high time for us to come together, bring those ideas together, and set a pattern for African unity. My role will be played equally as any other African youth that supports the same agenda. So education. Okay, another individual asked about education and foreign languages. Like, what do we do about the multiple languages? For instance, if we were to design our own education system with the multiple languages that we have across Africa, How do we make sure that we can, yeah, I think he's trying to ask how do we have a unique language where we can have our education system taught across the African continent. I just
Mhm.
want us to understand that English is not a traditional language in the continent. It was introduced and we accepted it, and it was here step by step. It moved on years until it becomes what it is today within the continent. So on the same vein, Africans can we can plan, we can sit down and initiate, bring our multiple languages and then put them into papers, of course, to understand which of them is going to entail all the things that we want as educators, as youths of Africa, and then we can have an education system that will be designed using those language. I think
Mhm.
already in the eastern part of Africa, we have seen Swahili, a language that has already, been accepted as official language in some parts of East Africa, and then we have seen the richness in the language. And equally, if you travel to places like West Africa, you also come to realize that some languages are found in almost all the countries. So using one or two among these languages will automatically help us to be able to enrich the real African education, and then to have our children to go to school learning this language and then to adapt to the African reality. So I just want to make everybody to understand that no country developed using a foreign language, and no
Correct.
country develops using a foreign culture. No country develops using a foreign education. Development has to be within, and it has to match with the reality of those societies.
Mhm.
So we really need to do a lot in towards that. Another individual also asked, what role can the African Union play in this situation? I think the African Union is the active player in this regard. In Africa, like in most cases, the problem is not between me and another African, but the problem is the system that is put in place. So
Correct.
the African Union was formed with aims and objectives, and one of those includes the unification of the continent. So they should be the active players, making sure that what we have at our national level, what we have at the countryside, are those agendas that they put forward at the international level, and that is at the AU level, making discussions and to make sure that the policies that they adopt are informed by the reality of the African continent. They don't just have to be there, accepting you know, policies or borrowing policies from the outside world. But those policies has to come from within, and that is the grassroots, making sure that whatever decision they are to take is informed by the reality of the African continent from
Correct.
various countries within from various countries, of course. So another individual also asked about our sentiment or our mindset towards Africans, like that is the inferiority complex. I think that is what he was trying to ask. And
Yes.
why do we feel so inferior in the eyes of a different person? It doesn't matter who the individual is. So, what we're trying to say here is that Africans need to understand the value of Africa, and we need to value one another. We need to recognize the dignity that we have as a race, and then to understand that the most important thing, the most important relation that we can have is that relation between us and our brothers and sisters.
Correct.
So making or having this complexity, this sentiment that somebody looks different, the individual is white or is whatsoever, therefore you look at them as more equal than the African, that is a mindset that we should do away from.
Mhm.
And we are seeing that because that is what our education system has been preaching to us. For
Correct.
far too long, we are made to understand that things that are white are good and
Mhm.
things that are black are not good. So what education system is that? And what do we learn from it? So that is why we need to look into all those things. And Africans has to recognize the dignity rooted in fellow Africans. Let us recognize our brothers and sisters. Let us honor them wherever they are. And as he said, even at the airports, various places you go, you find out that, we face the same problem, where an African will be treated differently with another individual. So we first need to recognize that dignity and observe that dignity as a people. Then from there we can fight things together. So somebody also asked, religious beliefs taught in school. I am
Mm-hmm.
I am a man of faith because I believe in religion, I believe in God, and I learn about religion from school. I learn about religion from my parents. Now, there is a big difference between religion and culture, and in most cases, we teach people culture instead of religion.
Mm-hmm.
No book, no book in its originality, I mean, no religion in its originality, I mean, is going to oppress individuals unless if that book fall into the wrong hands of individuals and they will interpret it into their own ways and then use it as a yardstick to oppress people. You don't use religion to oppress. You use religion to preach peace. You use religion to make sure that the people understand the reality of this life and the reality of the hereafter. So religion being taught in school, we just need to look into who are the actual people transmitting this religion from one generation to another, and what are we actually teaching the individual in school. And that all trickle down to our education system. Africa had a belief, and we need to understand those beliefs. We need to make sure that in our education system, things that we teach a child is in the interest of the African continent, and it is within the realities of the African continent.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what I have as an answer on that. And somebody also asked about the stock or at the stock exchange market and etc. Like, what does Africa have in stock for the outside world? We must
Mm-hmm.
know that we need to stop feeding the world with our raw materials. That is the main weakness that we have in our development. We cannot continue to feed the world with raw materials. We need the resources in Africa. We need the materials that we have. But because we are not transmitting it into finished products, we need to make sure that we invest in transformation, making sure that the raw material we have in Africa, we can transform that into something that will be productive. And it is the finished products that we will be sending to the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as we only give them raw materials, they will produce, they will take it, use their own industries, their own technologies, and etc., and then bring back the same issues. In fact, they will bring the worst part of it to the
Yes.
continent and then selling it at a very high price. So there's exploitation of resources. At the same time, they are, making profit at the expense of the masses. So that is what we should avoid. So if the free trade agreement is to be well implemented, African states have to rethink about export and import. What does Africa feeds the world, and what does Africa takes from the world as well? So another question was, what will I do or to help individuals on bringing them on board, like calling on the youths and etc. about Pan-Africanism, about my role as an African and etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is just the beginning of it. And then in the coming days, I'm looking forward to launching a movement within in the Gambia, and that will be spreading across the African continent, where we will talk about advocacy on the black, and then we will also talk about other issues within the African continent. And we'll also look into skill development, and also we'll also have skill centers within our own localities and etc., whereby people are going to receive quality education and have the opportunity to also develop other skills, because they may not find some of those issues in the formal schools and etc. So that is an area that we're looking in for, and very soon we will launch that movement within the Gambia, and therefore we'll spread it to the outside world.
Correct.
Yeah, so basically, I think these are the questions that I have.